All right, so today we're going deep on David Graeber,
Oh, yeah.
the anthropologist who,
Love to shake things up.
challenged the status quo.
Big time.
We're going to explore his life,
Yeah.
his work, and the impact he had on movements like Occupy Wall Street.
Definitely a fascinating figure.
Get ready for some serious, mind-blowing stuff here.
I think people would be surprised how relevant his ideas are even today.
For sure. So what's really striking about Graeber is
Well, a lot of things.
he wasn't just a critic.
No, he was.
He's an activist
Absolutely.
who was searching for,
Real-world solutions.
yes, and he often turned to, like, history.
And indigenous cultures for inspiration.
Right, like he was this walking encyclopedia of radical ideas,
He was,
but he could actually put them into practice.
which is rare.
Super rare. And the sources we got today really show this incredible journey
Yeah.
from his politically active upbringing.
Can you imagine?
I know, parents who were super involved in labor movements,
It's amazing.
to his research in Madagascar, where he was looking at power dynamics,
Kinship systems.
even magic.
It all ties together.
It does. His parents definitely gave him this deep sense of social justice.
Oh, yeah. You see that throughout his work.
Absolutely. And that research in Madagascar,
So important.
it wasn't just some academic exercise, right?
No, not at all.
He was trying to understand how power works at a fundamental level,
Exactly.
which led him to his groundbreaking work on debt.
That's where it all comes together.
Debt, the first 5,000 years,
The classic.
total game changer. It challenges everything we think we know about debt.
Oh, it does.
He shows how throughout history it's been used.
As a tool for control.
Yes, for exploitation.
And it's still happening today.
It is. It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
I know.
He takes us back to ancient Mesopotamia,
Way back.
where debt could lead to selling your family members into slavery.
It's shocking.
It makes you question this whole idea that debt is just a neutral economic transaction.
It's not.
It's not. Suddenly those student loans feel a lot heavier, you know?
Yeah. I feel that.
But Graeber doesn't just leave us in ancient Mesopotamia.
No, he doesn't.
He connects those ancient practices,
So what's happening today?
like the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, yeah.
Predatory lending was a huge part of that.
Absolutely.
And Graeber helps us see how those practices
are rooted in this long history of using debt as a tool of power.
Right. And it's not just about big banks and institutions.
No, it's not.
He also critiques the traditional anthropological view of bride wealth and dowry.
Which is interesting.
He argues that even these cultural practices can be twisted by commercial debt.
And used to exploit women's labor.
It's like, so this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
He points out that in some societies, as poor women were being commoditized through debt,
Right.
wealthy women were becoming increasingly secluded.
Wow.
It's this crazy interplay of class, gender, and economic systems.
It shows how interconnected everything is.
It does.
You can't separate these things.
You can't. It highlights how power dynamics play out across different groups.
Yeah. And Graeber's work constantly reminds us that individual choices are always shaped by these larger systems and forces.
Absolutely. Speaking of systems,
Yeah.
let's dive into Graeber's take on the history of wage labor.
This one's a bit counterintuitive.
It is.
Yeah.
He argues that in many cases, wage labor actually emerged from institutions of slavery.
Hard to believe, right?
It seems like a paradox.
But he uses some compelling historical examples.
He does. There's this one story that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah.
From 19th century Madagascar.
Okay.
Slaves there had a surprising level of autonomy.
Really?
Enough that they could actually rent themselves out for wages.
Wow.
And even hire other slaves to work for their masters.
Like a proto-gig economy within slavery.
Maybe
Makes you think about what free labor even means.
It does. And he talks about how in some Southeast Asian port cities, people would willingly take on debt to become indentured servants.
Because it gave them access to wage labor opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise.
So it's this weird twist where debt becomes a pathway to work.
But it's a pathway that also traps you in a system of dependence.
Exactly. It's classic Graeber, turning our assumptions upside down.
He was good at that.
He was. Now, in Northern Europe,
Okay.
specifically England, wage labor developed a bit differently.
Because they didn't have the same history of chattel slavery.
Right. But Graeber argues that debt still played a crucial role.
In shifting power dynamics.
Yes. English legal systems through things like the Statute of Artificers and the Masters and Servants Law.
Those are big ones.
They basically redefined workers as debtors to their employers.
It's fascinating how these laws slowly but surely shifted the balance of power,
They did.
solidifying this idea that workers owe their employers open-ended obedience.
It's like the language of debt was being used to legitimize a whole new social order.
It's really insightful.
And here's a little tidbit that blew my mind.
Okay.
Graeber points out that early on in this transition, employers would actually present themselves as debtors to their servants.
Really?
Even if it was just symbolic. It's almost as if they were trying to soften the blow of this power shift.
That's a subtle but really important observation.
It is. It reveals how ideology and power work together to shape social norms.
It makes you think about how we can challenge these deeply ingrained power structures.
And create a more equitable world.
Exactly. That's the big question.
That's the question Graeber wrestled with throughout his life.
And it led him to become deeply involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement.
It did. But we'll dive into that after a quick break.
Sounds good.
When we come back, we'll explore Graeber's role in Occupy and how his ideas help shape this global movement.
Can't wait. So before we jumped into the break, we were talking about how David Graeber's work made us rethink debt, labor, and power.
Totally challenged our assumptions.
But he wasn't just about critiquing the system, right?
No way.
He wanted to find ways to actually change things.
Exactly. And that's where Occupy Wall Street comes in.
Occupy.
He was a major figure in that movement.
He was.
And his ideas really shaped its philosophy and structure.
Yeah, he wasn't just an armchair intellectual.
No, he was right there in Zuccotti Park with everybody.
That's right.
What's interesting is Graeber didn't see Occupy as just about Wall Street.
Even though that was the name?
Right, it was the focal point.
Right.
But he saw it as this much broader critique of...
how society is organized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was really critical of what he called bullshit jobs.
Oh, yeah.
You remember those?
Vaguely.
Jobs that don't seem to serve any real purpose.
Right.
And just leave people feeling empty and unfulfilled.
Soul pressure.
Occupy was a way for people to push back against that.
To demand work that was meaningful.
Yeah. And that contributed to the common good.
It was about more than just work, though, wasn't it?
It was.
I mean, Graeber saw Occupy as this way to challenge the whole idea.
That our value as humans is tied to our productivity.
In a capitalist system.
Yeah. He was more interested in things like...
cooperation.
Creativity.
Caring for one another.
It was this radical vision of a society where people weren't just cogs in a machine.
Right.
But were free to pursue their passions.
And contribute their unique talents.
But the question is, how do you actually translate that vision into reality?
That's the challenge.
Occupy got a lot of attention.
It did.
But it ultimately didn't lead to any major structural change.
Yeah, and Graeber knew that changing the system wouldn't happen overnight.
I mean, it's a huge undertaking.
He believed that real change requires a fundamental shift.
In values.
Yeah, a move away from this hyper-individualism and greed that dominate our culture.
He often talked about the need to tap into our innate capacity for baseline communism.
Now, before anyone freaks out,
Right.
he wasn't talking about the Soviet Union or anything.
No, he was referring to the everyday acts of cooperation
And mutual aid,
that we all engage in.
like helping a neighbor,
sharing food.
volunteering,
It's about recognizing that we are all interconnected.
and that our well-being depends on each other.
Exactly. Graeber believed that if we could nurture those instincts,
We could start to build a more just and sustainable world
and he drew a lot of inspiration.
from indigenous societies.
Yeah, that it developed sophisticated systems of governance.
Based on consensus and egalitarianism.
So instead of these top-down hierarchies where power is concentrated in the hands of a few,
He envisioned a more decentralized system
more horizontal.
where communities could govern themselves.
And he saw technology as a way to facilitate that kind of direct democracy.
Like a tool for empowerment.
Right. Imagine a world where everyone has a voice in the decisions that affect their lives.
Where power is shared and resources are distributed fairly.
That was the kind of world Graeber was fighting for.
A powerful vision.
It is, but it also seems incredibly difficult to achieve.
It's a huge challenge.
We're talking about changing not just laws and institutions, but also deeply ingrained cultural norms and values.
It's a long-term project.
So where do you even begin?
Well, Graeber believed in the power of what he called everyday forms of resistance.
Oh.
Things like supporting local businesses,
Boycotting unethical corporations.
creating alternative financial institutions like credit unions,
It's about taking back our economic power.
and using it to support systems that align with our values.
Graeber also saw a lot of potential in movements to reclaim the commons.
The commons.
You know, those resources that should be shared collectively?
Rather than being privately owned.
Like public parks.
Library.
Even knowledge itself.
The things we all need.
It's about recognizing that some things are too important to be left to the market.
They belong to all of us.
And Graeber was always quick to point out that these kinds of movements aren't new.
People have been resisting oppression for centuries.
Fighting for a better world.
As long as there have been hierarchies and systems of control.
He was a big fan of prefigurative politics.
Prefigurative politics.
Basically the idea that we can create the world we want to see right now through our actions.
Even if the larger system hasn't changed yet.
It's about building the future in the present.
Graeber really believed in the power of people.
To create change from the ground up.
He wasn't waiting for some leader to come and fix everything.
Yes, he was out there doing the work.
Organizing.
Inspiring others to take action.
He was such a powerful voice for change.
He was.
But what about those who are focused on more drastic measures?
Like who?
Like the Liquidate Wall Street movement that's gaining traction.
Oh, right.
Some are taking matters into their own hands.
Trying to exploit the market.
To take down hedge funds.
Interesting.
Graeber was definitely critical of Wall Street.
He was.
But he wasn't advocating for just tearing down the system.
Without a plan.
Yeah, without a clear vision for what would replace it.
That's important.
He would probably caution against tactics that focus solely on destruction.
Without a plan for building something new and better?
Exactly. It's not enough to just be against something. You have to be for something, too.
Have a vision.
You need a vision, a strategy, and a willingness to work together.
To create the world you want to see.
And that brings us to Graeber's ideas about democracy.
Which were just as radical and thought-provoking as his views on debt and labor.
He had a lot to say about democracy.
He believed that true democracy is about so much more than just casting a vote every few years.
More than just elections.
He saw it as a way of life.
A process of ongoing dialogue.
And collective decision-making.
That involves everyone.
And that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive into the life and work of David Graeber.
It's going to be good.
Okay, so we've looked at Graeber's ideas on debt labor and even that vision he had for a more just world.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there.
Now let's get into something he was really passionate about.
What's that?
Democracy.
Oh, yeah.
And fair warning, his views on this might ruffle some feathers.
He was never afraid to challenge the status quo.
That's for sure. He was really critical of what he called the illusion of choice.
In modern democracies.
You know that feeling that you're given these limited options?
Within a system that's already rigged.
Exactly. It's like you get to choose A or B.
But C was never even on the table.
And it creates this sense of apathy, like your voice doesn't really matter.
Because the real decisions are made by
people with power.
And money.
Right. And Graeber saw this as a strategy to maintain control.
To keep people from demanding more.
He believed that the complexities of bureaucracy and electoral politics are designed to disempower people.
To make them feel like they're just cogs in a machine.
Yeah, so if this top-down system isn't working...
What's the alternative?
What did Graeber see as a truly democratic society?
Well, he was really inspired by historical examples of direct democracy. Ancient Athens.
Okay.
Some indigenous societies.
Where people were actively involved in decision-making.
Not just through voting.
But through
ongoing deliberation.
Consensus building.
Exactly. It's that whole idea of power to the people.
Right. But how do you make that work in a large, complex society?
It's definitely a challenge.
It sounds kind of chaotic.
Graeber acknowledged that, but he believed that true democracy shouldn't be a spectator sport.
You can't just sit on the sidelines.
It should be woven into the fabric of everyday life.
Okay, so how do you do that?
He was a big proponent of consensus-based decision-making.
Where everyone has a voice.
And decisions are made with the consent of the governed.
We actually saw this in action during Occupy Wall Street, didn't we?
Yeah, the way they organized their general assemblies and working groups.
It was a reflection of Graeber's vision for a more participatory democracy.
It was a living experiment, you could say.
An attempt to create a space where people could come together as equals.
To discuss, debate, and make decisions collectively.
And while Occupy may not have achieved all of its goals,
it did show the potential of direct democracy.
It's interesting how Graeber's ideas about democracy connect back to his critiques of debt and labor.
It's all part of a larger critique of power.
Absolutely. For Graeber, true freedom required not just economic justice, but also genuine democratic participation.
He believed people should have control over their own lives.
Their work.
Their communities.
And the decisions that affect them.
He wasn't just about tearing things down, though.
Right, he had a constructive side too.
He was passionate about building new and better alternatives.
Remember prefigurative politics.
Building the world you want to see through your actions.
Even if the system hasn't caught up yet.
Exactly. He believed in the power of small-scale experiments.
Like what?
Worker cooperatives.
Alternative media platforms.
Community gardens.
He saw these as seeds that could grow into something much larger.
Inspiring others.
Showing that different ways of living are possible.
It's about planting the seeds for a better future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and work of David Graeber,
what have we learned?
What's the lasting impact of his ideas?
Well, Graeber was a visionary thinker.
He really was.
He challenged us to question everything.
To think outside the box.
To imagine a world without debt, without bullshit jobs, without oppressive hierarchies.
A world where everyone has a voice.
And he showed us that another world is possible.
Not through some grand plan, but through the everyday actions of people working together.
To create a more just and equitable society.
He truly believed in the power of people to make a difference.
And his work continues to inspire us.
To challenge the status quo.
To embrace cooperation.
And to build the world we want to see.
David Graeber's legacy reminds us that change is possible.
One step at a time.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a fascinating journey.